He walked into a room, picked up a bass, and told people out loud that he was the greatest bass player in the world. And the terrible thing, the thing that made him impossible to argue with, is that he might have been right. 11 years later, that same man was sleeping on a park bench in the city where he grew up, banned from almost every club in the county, and had been reduced to asking strangers for money outside the venues that used to book him. On a September night in 1987, he was refused entry to a small club in Wilton, Manors, Florida, at around 4 in the morning. What happened in the next few minutes is still disputed today. 9 days later, Jaco Pastorius was dead at 35, and the man responsible served roughly 4 months. This is not the story of a genius who burned bright and flamed out, which is how it usually gets told. That version is comfortable, and it's wrong. This is what actually happened, what he did to the instrument that no one had done before, what was happening inside his head while it happened, what the industry did and didn't do about it, and why the argument about his final night still isn't settled. Before we start, something about this video and this channel. This is the first episode of a new series called Bass Legends. For 26 videos, this channel has been about what to buy, the traps, the gold mines, the specs. This series is about the other half. The people who made those instruments matter in the first place. The gear videos aren't going anywhere. But you can't honestly cover this instrument and never talk about the players who change what it is. This whole series will live in a playlist linked in the description, and one promise specific to this format, because it's a real person in a real death. Where something is documented, this video says so. Where something is disputed, this video says that too, and tells you who disputes it. There is no gossip in here presented as fact. Every claim traces to a published source, and the significant ones are named on screen. Now, to understand how far he fell, you have to understand how high he actually got. John Francis Pastorius III was born in 1951 in Pennsylvania and raised in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. He started out as a drummer, and by most accounts a very good one, until a wrist injury playing football made drumming painful enough that he moved to bass. That injury is one of the most consequential accidents in the history of the instrument, because the bass he moved to was not going to stay the way he found it. The electric bass in the early 1970s had a settled job. It sat under the music. It held the bottom. It was rhythm, foundation, support, and the players who did it best were praised for exactly that, for staying out of the way and locking in. There were exceptions, but the role was understood. Jaco simply refused the job description. He took a Fender jazz bass and pulled the frets out of the fingerboard, filling the slots with wood putty and coating the board in epoxy. That instrument became known as the Bass of Doom, and the reason it mattered is what came out of it. Without frets, the notes could slide and bend and sing the way a fretless, upright, or a human voice does, but with the sustain and the electric punch of a solid body instrument. He combined that with a technique built on harmonics, bell-like tones most bassists barely touched, and a rhythmic sense drawn from the Caribbean and Latin music he'd grown up around in South Florida. The result did not sound like a bass supporting a song. It sounded like a lead instrument that happened to occupy the low end. And in 1976, two things happened almost at once. He released his self-titled debut album, and he joined Weather Report. That record opens with a piece called Donna Lee, a bebop head played on fretless electric bass, at tempo, accompanied only by congas. Bass players who heard it in 1976 described the same reaction, over and over. Not admiration, but confusion. It was not clear that what they were hearing was possible on the instrument they own. With Weather Report, he made Heavy Weather, the album with Birdland on it, and that record did something almost no jazz fusion album does. It sold in the hundreds of thousands. He played with Joni Mitchell across 4 albums, and his playing on those records is one of the reasons they still sound unlike anything else in her catalog. He was, by the late 70s, simultaneously the most influential and the most imitated bass player alive, and he was in his 20s. And it's worth being honest about the arrogance, because it's part of the story rather than a footnote to it. The line about being the greatest bass player in the world was not a one-off joke. He said it often to people who had not asked. Some found it unbearable. Others noticed that he tended to say it and then immediately prove it. which is a harder thing to be annoyed by. Either way, that enormous public confidence sat directly on top of something that was not confidence at all. Jaco Pastorius was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. That is not a retrospective armchair diagnosis by a documentary. It is documented, and it is the single most important fact in the second half of his life. And here is where the story stops being a rock and roll cautionary tale and becomes something harder to watch. In the early 80s, the behavior changed. He would show up to gigs in ways that made no sense. He gave away money, instruments, possessions. He was thrown out of venues. The famous stories from this period get retold as wild genius anecdotes, the eccentric guy doing outrageous things. And reading them now, with the diagnosis in front of you, they read completely differently. They are not anecdotes, they are symptoms happening in public to a man in an industry that had no framework for what it was looking at. He was fired from Weather Report in 1981. Alcohol and drugs entered the picture, both of which are catastrophically bad in combination with an untreated mood disorder, and both of which made it easier for everyone around him to reach for the simpler explanation, that he was difficult, that he was on something, that he had become unreliable. That explanation required nothing of anybody. The real one would have. By the mid-80s, the descent was near total. He had been divorced. He was broke. He was periodically homeless in Fort Lauderdale, sleeping in a park in the city where he had grown up, in the same county where he was, in musical terms, one of the most important figures alive. People who encountered him in this period describe a man who was sometimes lucid and sometimes not, and who was still, in flashes, extraordinary on the instrument. He was banned from a long list of local venues. That fact matters for what happened next. On the night of September 11th into the early hours of September 12th, 1987, he tried to get into the Midnight Bottle Club in Wilton, Manors, Florida, one of the places he was barred from. It was around 4:20 in the morning. He was refused entry. Here is where the accounts diverge, and this video is not going to pretend otherwise. The club's manager, a man named Luke Havan, said that Pastorius kicked at the doors of the club, that Pastorius struck him first, and that he hit Pastorius once in self-defense, and that Pastorius fell and struck his head on the pavement. At least one eyewitness gave a materially different account, describing a far more severe and sustained beating than a single defensive blow. What is not in dispute? Jaco Pastorius suffered catastrophic head injuries. He was taken to hospital. He never regained consciousness. He remained in a coma for 9 days, and on the 21st of September, 1987, he died. He was 35 years old. Luke Havan was initially charged with second-degree murder. In November of 1988, more than a year after the incident, he pleaded guilty to the substantially lesser charge of manslaughter. He served a period widely reported as around 4 months of custody. A 35-year-old man was beaten into a fatal coma outside a bar, and the outcome was months, not years. You are allowed to find that unacceptable. Many people who knew him did, and said so publicly, and are still saying it. So what is the truth underneath all of this, once you strip away the version where he's just a wild genius who self-destructed? The first thing is that he did not fail as a musician. That framing gets applied constantly, and it's simply false. He was not washed up, he had not run out of ideas, he was not a man whose talent had deserted him. He was a man with a serious, diagnosable, treatable psychiatric illness, in an era and an industry with essentially no mechanism for treating it, surrounded by people who read the symptoms as a personality. The second thing is harder. The mythology around musicians actively concealed him. In a culture that treats erratic behavior as authenticity, that calls chaos living hard, and treats it as evidence of genius rather than evidence of illness, a man in genuine crisis becomes almost invisible. Everything that should have been alarming was legible as normal. He was hiding in plain sight inside a story the industry likes to tell about itself. And the third thing is what he left. Every fretless electric bass sold today exists in a market he created. The idea that the bass can carry melody, that it can be a voice rather than a foundation, moved from heresy to obvious largely because of him. Players who have never knowingly heard a Jaco recording play in ways that trace directly back to him. He was inducted into the Downbeat Hall of Fame. He is one of very few bassists there. His bass of doom, the fretless jazz bass he built by pulling out its own frets, was stolen while he was alive. It surfaced years after his death and was recovered. That instrument now sits in the world as an object, which is a strange and slightly unbearable thing, because the thing that made it matter was never the wood. Here is the honest verdict, and it is not the tidy one. Jaco Pastorius did not die of excess, and he did not die of genius. And both of those readings let too many people off the hook. He died of a head injury inflicted outside a bar he'd been banned from. At 35, at the end of years of untreated illness, that everyone around him had a vocabulary for misreading. What we lost is not just the records he didn't make. It's the 50-year-old and the 70-year-old version of him. The elder statesman he never got to become, in a lineage that badly needed one. If you take one thing from this, the next time you hear a musician's chaos described as part of their magic, it's worth asking whether somebody is actually in trouble. That question, asked out loud in 1984, might have changed how this ended. This has been the first episode of Bass Legends. The full series is in the playlist linked below, and the sources for everything stated here are listed in the description, including which parts of that final night remain disputed and by whom. Tell me in the comments who the series should cover next. There are names that belong here for what they built, and names that belong here for what happened to them, and a few, like this one, that belong for both. Subscribe for honest, no-hype truth about bass, the gear and the people, and go listen to Donna Lee properly once. It still doesn't sound possible.